That is awesome. Thanks so much. Jeremy, would you like to go?
Yeah, hi. Hello, everyone. I'm Jeremy. I am eating right now, so that's why I had my camera off. But I'm a teacher. I do a lot on uh, African American history. I'm an English teacher, but that's my main focus and my main spreading of goals. And I'm looking to get more informed about Black and Indigenous collaboration. So, yep, that's why I'm here. Good to meet everybody and see everybody again.
That's awesome. Thanks, Jeremy. And Tovio, would you like to go? Okay. Well, we don't know where Tovio is, but Tovio, I'll just give an introduction. Tovio is really cool. Um, she is just can do like computer coding stuff. I don't know the terms and stuff, so maybe I'm not giving the best introduction. But she codes and stuff. She streams on Twitch and she's been streaming this game called Tunic, but one thing that's been also really cool is she's been streaming her notes while she's reading Kwame Nkrumah's I think it's called Conscientiousness, and it talks about it's a philosophy text on like the conscientiousness of like a colonial mindset. And so it's really cool because it's like a philosophy on what colonialism is, and she's been taking notes and streaming them. So I think that's pretty cool. But yeah, she also juggles, and she's just one of those people where there's just like all these like really just interesting facts about her where you're like, oh wow, like that's really cool that you do that. Um, but yeah, so let's get started with this book club. We're streaming right now, so for anyone who's watching, we are going over the last chapter of The Red Deal, and we're just going over the conclusion. So today we're going to talk a little bit about that, and then just talk about in general things that we really liked about it. This is a really, 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 really good book. I highly recommend it. It's very short and it summarizes a lot. It summarizes everything very well, and then it gives like really clear things like what we can do to try to combat the issues it brings up. So I love it because it's very hopeful and inspiring, which I think we need a little bit more of because I can often feel very doom and gloom. And so this book has been very inspiring, and I highly recommend it. So without further ado, let's just dive into some of the notes that I have. I'll share my screen, so if anyone wants to look at them, we can. Um, so let's see. So the conclusion is divided up into two parts. Um, it's infrastructure of relation and the power of words. So in the section infrastructure of relation, um, it's talking about how basically like there's a setup infrastructure like that's literal and physical. That's kind of like the structures that capitalism implements, and it talks about how we need to set up a more holistic infrastructure that's not just physical but philosophical. So one of the first quotes that I want to share is this quote by uh, Friede Friede Husen. Sorry, the text is a little bit small on my screen. Um, so free, all right, maybe it's Frieda Husen. I should make sure I'm not saying this name wrong. Yes, it is Frieda Husen. So she says that salmon is our food source. It's our main staple food. That's one of our critical infrastructures. And there's berries that are critical, and there's berries that are a critical infrastructure because the berries not only feed us, they also feed the bears. And the salmon also doesn't just feed us; they feed the bears. All of that is part of the system that our people depend on. And that whole cycle and system is our critical infrastructure. And that's what we're trying to protect, an infrastructure that we depend on. So I wrote that quote down because I thought it was really just I felt like it really captured like this mentality of like, okay, infrastructure isn't just something that like we need as individuals that we immediately depend on. Like in capitalism, it's like, okay, well, we need food and we're gonna get that food even if it means completely running an environment or an ecosystem, right? Like instead it's like, well, actually we need food, and this food's also important to not only us, it's important to these other beings as well. And it's a very holistic, it's a more encompassing approach to everyone who is dependent on this, and keeps in mind everyone who needs this. Um, so on 141, it talks about the infrastructure we must dismantle. It's not only physical, but philosophical. We must dismantle the philosophy and how it relates to destruction, or the philosophy of money, I think is what I meant to type out. Or in other words, we must destroy capitalism. This section is talking about how the structure of capitalism is one that is destructive. Um, Another great quote that it says, we do not want to endure any longer, we want to thrive. It is for this reason that we cannot accept a path other than decolonization. Sovereignty flows directly from the origin story to be a good relative. Um, and then it talks about having, an economy based on caretaking, which is so much what this book focuses on. Um, and it talks about how we can have this caretaking economy by focusing on enforcing an indigenous political, scientific, and economic order to successfully prevent our mass ruin. And this is the question that we all face. So that's kind of a summary of the section. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on creating an infrastructure of caretaking as opposed to a capitalist one. Any thoughts on that?
I th yeah, so I really I liked the entire book. And I want to preface for anyone that hasn't read it that's watching the stream right now. Um if you are not really a leftist, or if you are a leftist, especially if you're a Marxist, this is a very approachable book in that regard, Marxist Leninist, because it does kind of present everything through that type of language. It's very reminiscent almost of Lenin in the way he speaks, but without all the flowery bullshit and like being just as boring as watching paint dry. Sorry, Lenin is boring to read, but um yeah, the conclusion kind of obviously it reaffirms everything that it was saying in the, previous two sections of the book. And I think that the way that they present the need for a caretaking economy, or a caretaking society, I should say, that would include obviously a caretaking economy, a caretaking society. How do I word this? It's almost like, and they say it several times throughout the book: capitalism or extinction. And the need for a caretaking society is so necessary, because without it, you have basically the Nordic model. If you're just getting rid of capitalism without implementing some sort of caretaking society, you just have the Nordic model. And don't get me wrong, Scandinavia is still capitalist. But my point is, you're just implementing the Nordic model, where people are still suffering, where you're still exporting all of your production to the global south, and, exploiting them, getting your avocados and your coffee and your chocolate through literal child slavery, and the destruction of not just humans, but also the and in their animal and plant nations, and our mountain relatives, and water relatives and air relatives and all these other things. You can't have a caretaking economy. My point is this: you can't have the caretaking economy for just humans. You have to have it for everyone and everything. When I'm saying Medicare for all, I'm saying for all, not just me, not just my family, but like my bearded dragon that recently died. I didn't have $500 to take him to a vet. I had to try and treat him at home for under, $50. As a result, I wasn't able to help him. My animal ended up dying because of that, because people are trying to position humans as above everything else, when that is an antithetical to indigenous ways of conceptualizing the world. We're not above anything. We're on the same level as anything, as everything. So you cannot have a caretaking economy without, or a caretaking society, excuse me, without also caretaking everything around you. That includes plants, animals, the general landscape, mountains or, forests, swamps, lakes, all these other things. These things are absolutely fundamental to not necessarily restoring the earth, but at least like giving it some breathing room to restore itself. Because I think that's kind of a key component as well. We're not necessarily restoring anything as much as just giving the earth and animals the space to restore themselves. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And yeah, I think another thing that this book is getting at with the idea of caretaking is that we have to get rid of this idea of like just saving however much you need to save for yourself in any direct or immediate moment. That it is because I'm also worried that people listening might be like, oh, well, that's a nice idea, but we don't have to do that. And it's like, well, like, and I don't even know if the Red Deal puts it in these terms, but like, something that I just noticed when I look at a lot of indigenous societies is that like there is this kind of like take you can take care of the environment or otherwise environment's going to take care of you, because like you have to work in cooperation with the environment and the other biotic communities, otherwise you're not going to be able to survive. And I think, with capitalism, even though there's not actual scarcity, it's artificially created by capitalism. I think that like we're seeing that happen on a mass scale of this kind of like take care of the environment or else it's going to take care of you. Um, and it's just because of a lack of scarcity, which is great. We have these resources. People are not, well, people are still starving, but like sorry, I'm not saying this very eloquently. Like it's great that we have like these resources to live, but also it's kind of dragged out this issue where now we're really seeing the effects of climate change. And so we really just need to be living in a way where we're not hurting these other biotic communities, because the effects that that's going to hurt us. But again, even saying it in that way, it just is still not really what the Red Deal is getting at, because again, it's like, oh, we better care about these other communities or else it's going to hurt us. But we should really just care, period.
Yeah.
Akemi, I think you're sorry, I didn't see your hand up. If anyone just wants to hop in, just go for it.
Okay. Yeah, I was gonna say like some a way that I've heard it verbalized before is like you're in relation to everything, whether you realize it or not. Um, like we are in a sense one whole system, and like if your arm is not doing well and you don't take care of it, it's gonna affect the rest of your body. If you don't take care of a wound, it's gonna affect you, and like it's gonna deplete your health over time, whether it's immediately or like over time. um, and like you were saying with the climate and stuff, if you don't take care of it, it will take care of you, or like it'll like in like a bad way. um and a kind of example of that is like here in Florida, the weather's been all kinds of wacky. Like last 3 days ago it was like 85 degrees and it was so hot, and then yesterday it was like 60, and like it's just happening like this all the time, even more and more. And I think a friend said that eventually it's going to get just to the point where it just stops cold snapping and just super hot all the time. Not excited for that. Um, but on the other side of that, I've noticed like I've started growing some like Okinawan spinach and like other things, like mango and avocado, and like I think mango and Okinawan spinach at least like do better in like hotter, warmer climates. So that's one way that we can like, and I think they mention it in this section as well, like to start like gardening and learning how to do those things so that you can learn how to like work with the earth at the stage that it's at now. So
I might have to hit you up for some of them mangoes.
so far I have two trees. They're like about 2 feet tall. I don't know if they're gonna bear fruit because I got them from like I just rooted grocery store mangoes. So we'll see if they fruit in a couple years. But
Hmm.
Wow, that'd be so
Well,
cool.
and that's interesting that Akemi brings that up because and I've said this a few times. And I think this really drives point kind of or drives home kind of the point of what what they were saying. I'm sorry, I don't know your pronouns.
Yeah,
Um,
them. Thank you. I was gonna
yeah,
change my name, but I couldn't figure out how to do that.
oh, like they were with planting trees and they're not sure if they're going to fruit. And I think this really drives the point home. And I've said this before: a single tree can kill an entire orchard. One tree can absolutely destroy that orchard. And what I mean by that is, no, it's not going to, cause all those other trees to die. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is if you actually look at the biology of trees, a lot of them actually communicate through either fungal methods, underground fungal networks, or they communicate through, I don't think it's necessarily pheromones as much as it's just chemical reactions that they release into the air. So on an apple orchard or a plum orchard, or if you have a mango orchard or plan to have a mango orchard, if you do not treat one of those trees with respect, it will shut down that entire orchard and you will get nothing from it. And it's the same thing with like wild mulberries. We got mulberries all over the goddamn place here in Iowa. And if you don't treat those mulberry trees with some level of respect, all of those mulberry trees are not going to produce fruit. And it's, the same thing with several other plants, not just trees. It's not just trees that do that. You have to, it's not just, oh, I'm just, watering these trees or laying fertilizer around these trees or whatever for my sake. No, you're not just doing it for your sake. You're doing it because that is an actual community of living, breathing things. Like an orchard, you can think of as a micro community because that's what it is. Those trees are communicating with each other. And they're gonna, if you respect them, they'll respect you. And I know that that almost sounds like I'm sort of anthropomorphizing these trees, but it might come off as like some spiritual woo woo, but it is actually an actual fact. And like Akemi was saying earlier, how we're part of a greater whole. To take this to a more biological place or evolutionary place, that is true. Phylogenetically, we're still fish. That's weird to think about, but like phylogenetically, we are still fish. You never grow out of the clade of your ancestors, even if you start a new one for yourself. Like that's a weird concept, but it is the case. We're still monkeys, or we're still new old world monkeys. We're still apes, even if we're a different clade from our the ancestors that we diverged from. It's a weird thing to think about, but it is true. We're still tetrapods. We're still, all of these other things. We are literally connected to all of these things. We still share common genetics with all of these other things, with, banana peppers, with, my dog, my little 11-pound bridge troll in a dog costume. I still share common DNA with her. So we are actually all connected. Hopefully, I didn't ramble too much. I am still coming out of the other end of bronchitis. Hopefully, I was cogent enough for that.
Yeah, add on to that, like you tree can kill a whole orchard, and I learned about like on the other end of that, I learned about mass fruiting, where there's like certain trees, I think they might be nut trees that like will not fruit for like 7 years or something, and then once everyone's ready, they'll all fruit like all across the continent at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And on like a smaller like ecosystem scale, like I can kind of tell when I'm doing bad when I'm not taking care of my plants. Like when they're not doing well, I know I'm not doing well because I'm not taking time to like take care of me to take care of them. So that's another thing I wanted to point out. Um, and also something that just came to mind when you think of like indigenous cultures that are still on their land, like that land holds their ancestors, like the bones of like their ancestors and like the spirits and stuff, like have now after generations become the land. So in that sense, like your ancestors, if you're still on your land, are like still nourishing you in that way, and it's like a cycle in that sense as well.
Mhm.
Yeah, really great thoughts. Is there anything else that anyone wants to add before we go on to the next section, the power of words? All right. So in this next section, so it says the writers. Oh, so this is just a summary. I'll just read this summary of this section. So the writers of this book find words to be a powerful form of action. All right. So yeah, I felt it really interesting because um they are really hoping that people are inspired to write themselves, which I thought was really interesting because I think, especially like on YouTube and Twitch, there's like this kind of discourse of like, well, people who are online are talking about things too much rather than action. And, they talk about how like writing is a really important form of action. And they also talk about how it's really important to make work that speaks to the people. There's a quote where they say that uh, they talk about how this was written by the people for the people, and they mentioned that the people who have edited this book are, there have been scholars, but it's also just edited and looked over by people who are not necessarily academics, people who are just also the people who are going through the things we talked about and experienced, because they really want it to be written by the people for the people. And I really think this book has accomplished that. I think that's why I like it so much. Um, so yeah, that's one thing that this section is getting at. I'll just read this quote here on 144. It says, "If humanity were already following the guidance of indigenous people, we would be in a much different situation, and we would not have to write yet another program for liberation. We certainly do not write enough for our own people in a way that speaks to their hardest struggles and deepest dreams. We thus take our people seriously. We are not apart from our people. We are the people." And then I will read this next quote on 146. "The Red Nation is not asking for a seat at the table of the ruling class or of the left. It is telling humanity to listen to indigenous people. Don't just take our lead, for as Haudenosaunee feminist Teresa McCarthy argues, assertions of indigenous knowledge provide models for the text is really small for this, models that pose alternatives to mainstream ideas, something we desperately need in these times." Um, yeah, I'll just read one more quote. Sorry, hopefully I'm not like just bogging people down with quotes. I just think they kind of all tie in together. And so they end the conclusion with this. The struggle to remember our humanity through our love for the earth will define the future for all. Join us. We are waiting for you. We welcome you, and we are ready to act. I thought that was like a really powerful ending where it's an invitation to everyone. I like that it's an invitation to everyone, and then also the quote that I read before is like, we're not asking for a seat at the table, we're asking you to listen to us. And I also like that it specifically said we're not asking a seat at a table necessarily on the left. We're just asking everyone to listen to us. I kind of like that approach. Like, it makes me think of like, not to get into it, but just like, even when I think of the online left, I'm like, I don't necessarily know if I want to like identify with these people because it's messed up. So I like that it's just like, okay, you just need to listen to indigenous people, period. And I like that it's just kind of like this statement for everyone. And I like how it ends where it's like, we are inviting you, because both of those things are true. A lot of times people think it's like exclusive, where it's like, hey, when people say listen to us, then they don't think it's an invitation for collaboration. And I like how it's like, you need to listen to indigenous people, and this is an invitation for you to join. I really, really appreciated that. There's so many things in this book where it just makes these very succinct distinctions in like a couple paragraphs, and they do a great job at that. They summarize a lot in this book, like a lot, and they did it very succinctly. So very impressive. Any thoughts on that?
So I actually do appreciate. So there's a couple things I appreciate about kind of the way that they handled compiling this book. It's they state, and obviously I agree with you with the, especially Twitter. It's a microcosm of dumpster fire, but especially with the way that they present the issues. So they say these are the issues, right? Like homelessness, poverty, general poverty, obviously, destruction of life. these are issues, but here are ways to, and they're not saying it in a way of these are the only ways to do it. They're saying here are a couple of examples that we can give you to help combat these problems, to start getting the ball rolling on, decolonization and land back, which they, call out a couple of times throughout the book. But also, I appreciate that they're not, and Leanne Simpson makes mention of it in her book, as we've always done. And I actually just ordered Red Skin, White Masks by Glenn Coulthard, which, if that book is what I think it's about, it's talking about what I'm about to say. And it's the rejection of recognition. So, what I mean by that is not necessarily recognizing, like, oh, that person is indigenous, or oh, that person is, black, or oh, that person is a communist, or oh, that person is a Democrat. Like, not necessarily that. Um, what I'm talking about is more along the lines of what Leanne Simpson talks about in her book, and this is well into like towards the end of the book that she talks about it, but it's the rejection of the popular left narrative, especially within the West, like the United States, Canada. It's the rejection of that narrative, not because the politics are wrong necessarily. I don't have a problem with communism or anarchism. I'm, an indigenous nationalist with anarcho-communist tendencies. That's just the easiest kind of shorthand that I can use for people. But basically, what I took it to mean is rejecting the popular narrative because it is couched in whiteness entirely, especially in the West, that is built on whiteness or white supremacy. So it's rejecting those narratives and those sorts of rhetorics, and instead centering things on the indigenous narrative or the indigenous way of doing just the act of being indigenous. Because I don't want to call it a narrative or a rhetoric because that just simplifies it down too much. It centers it or recenters it on the act of being indigenous. The way of living indigenously. And that is not necessarily racially exclusive because that also applies to, of like Arab people, that also applies to Asian people, that also applies to black people, that also applies to what we colloquially consider as white people. For example, the Irish people, the IRA, the Republicans of Ireland, the actually good ones. It centers that act of simply being indigenous and rejects the popular narrative, which is fundamentally couched in that white supremacy. And again, they don't necessarily go too much into detail with that in the Red Deal. Leanne Simpson does cover that very briefly in her book, as we've always done. And while I haven't started Glenn Coulthard's book, I do get a feeling that that's generally what that's talking about.
Mhm.
Hopefully, what I said makes sense.
Yeah, I have a question. So, like, when you talk about like couching the popular narrative, can you give example of like what popular narrative you're talking about, or just like in general, just like when we talk about these things, it's couched in whiteness.
So, and I'm gonna recommend a YouTube. Well, he doesn't really use YouTube anymore, but Quinn Rabbit on YouTube. So if you listen to or if you listen to a lot of the left rhetoric, it comes from people like Marx and Bakunin and Lenin and Stalin, which isn't bad necessarily, but they approach their arguments backwards. Don't get me wrong, just right up the top, I respect Marx, I respect Lenin, even though they're fucking boring to read. I respect their work. They did good things for Europeans at the time. But everyone kind of takes it as this sort of dogma and nothing really updates.
Oh my
They
gosh,
are
yeah.
trying to apply they're trying to apply these lessons that are at their core, they're fine. Yes, communism is fine. I have no problem with it, like I said. But they're trying to apply these lessons for like 16th century, 17th century, 18th, and 19th century Europe to 21st century United States, which is fundamentally different from Europe because the people of Europe were not displaced from their homelands. Whereas native people, us, myself and, Silver Spook and, Positive Synergy or Wasigan, if he were here, we were displaced on our own lands. We were basically kicked out of our own homes, so to speak. Or our lands are illegally occupied and now currently being fucking poisoned, in the case of Red Hill. Um, you cannot apply the same lessons of communism from 18th century Europe to 21st century United States because you're fundamentally dealing with an illegitimate state from the outset rather than something that grew out of a feudal era. Does that kind of clear that up a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I have a very similar frustration where, when I made, this book club's called Leftist Book Club, and at first I was going to try to read, some Marx and Kropotkin, and I remember we read Peter Kropotkin, Mutual Aid, and then got to the section just called Savages, and I remember I was like, you know
Right.
what? We don't need to do this. We just don't have to do because when when I'm in school and stuff and you see something that's really messed up that's like racist or sexist, I have to compartmentalize it because I'm in school and I have to read this text and I'm like, you know what? I'm not in school anymore. We're just not going to do this. I know people love Peter Kropotkin. I know it's from his time. And you know what? I'm not doing this right now. And so we've just been focusing on we focus a lot on black authors, but really I'm like, I really want to learn about these ideas of communism, socialism, anarchism from non-white people. And uh, that's kind of what the book club has been about, basically. So, but yeah, that frustration that you hold is like, it's like, I really, really, like, I'm embarrassed to say, like, I haven't read any Lenin and I really should. And also, like, I just, like, don't know if I have it in me to read another dead white person. Like, I just want to hear, like, like an indigenous or black person talking about those ideas. And then also, Tovio, you were talking the other day about Kwame Nkrumah, and I don't want to botch this idea that you're talking about, but just the way that, like, Engels had, felt like he had to talk about communism from an economic standpoint because that's that's the way that people weren't going to pay attention unless you're talking about economics. But literally, what this comes down to are, like, are people happy? Like, that's kind of like the important thing. That's the kind of the important thing. And then, like, how do we take this philosophy of trying to make a better world and apply it to where we are today, right now? Because something that Tove and I were talking about, like, is on the left. You have people kind of like arguing, like, oh, like, I like this idea and I'm going to compare this idea, but I don't like that idea. I'm going to compare it to that, as opposed to this idea we can implement right now with what's going on right now. Like, and I think what happens is we end up just kind of talking about these, like, ideas, comparing, contrasting them, debating them of people of dead white guys who died like 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and it's not relevant in the same way. But I don't know if you wanted to add on to that, Tovia, because I think the book you're
Yeah,
reading is really interesting.
yeah. So in conscientism, right? Nkrumah includes this Engels quote where Engels is like, "I'm sorry." Basically, he's like, "I'm sorry, we fucked up. We talked about economics and we didn't center humans, and uh, all of our theory should really be about life and the production and reproduction of life." And he's saying that with some self-consciousness at the time. And yeah, he's like, we keep arguing economics because I think kind of the takeaway is capitalism so dehumanized people that the only way that they could have these arguments was in terms of human capital in a way, and in human production, which is you know pretty estranged from any sort of ideas of joy or happiness. But I think Nkrumah puts that in place to get back to what you were just saying regarding the philosophical frameworks, right? Like these socialist and communist philosophical frameworks that are really outdated, right? They're not immediately applicable. They're not right now. They're not contemporaneous. And Nkrumah puts it in terms of the colonial student versus the ordinary African, where the colonial student is like chosen by the colonial power to learn all these monuments, right? All these monuments of philosophical thought, and to learn them in a comparative rationale. It's like, oh, here's Kant, and here's Aristotle, and here's Marx, and we can compare and contrast them, and that's great. But the actual only universal laws are those defined by the colonial power, and then that colonial student goes back to the colonized state as a servant of the parent state, right? And that's kind of how Nkrumah looks at all the colonial education systems. But he contrasts that with who he describes as the ordinary African, who reads this theory and reads it completely in the context of what are we going to do with this for the purpose of national liberation. And yeah, that's kind of the encapsulated idea, I think.
And so and Leanne Simpson also, and for anyone that hasn't read the book, I do recommend As We've Always Done, because she does basically hit on every single point we're going to talk about as well, and especially what Tovio just said with the framework of, these colonial scholars going and, learning Kant and Hegel and Marx and, Aristotle, Plato, all these other guys. And don't get me wrong, I've read these guys too. They're all boring. I'm sorry, white people, you suck at writing. Get better. But by and large, when they come back and they're chosen as these sort of, held up as these sort of talking heads for the settler state, the parent state. Fundamentally, and I've had this discussion before actually with a professor of philosophy, philosophy itself has been so whitewashed that it completely ignores, it almost separates, and this is going to be kind of hard to explain, but I'll do my best. So, with philosophy, especially, we use philosophy every day of our lives. We use ethics and all these other things every day of our lives. But we treat it as this thing that you have to go to college and learn. You have to spend 6 years studying in a dusty classroom or a lecture hall, listening to some blowhard talk about how great Kant and Nietzsche were, versus a more holistic approach, which is indigenous. We can say it's indigenous. And I'm not talking indigenous as in just North America or just South America. I mean global indigenous. It's much more indigenous to recognize, like, yeah, philosophy is just part of life. You use ethics every day. You weigh moral goods and moral bads every single day of your life. And you use these other, you use ontology, whether or not you're using ontology every day of your life, just as you're using all these economic philosophies every day of your life. You don't necessarily need to go out and learn these things. You already have them, whether or not you're aware of it. But the way that whiteness itself, or uses these institutions, or uses these social tools, is by separating them out from the actual just act of being a human with a brain, with the ability to think. It separates these things out and makes it seem like it's this lofty kind of, degree that you have to get through years of rigorous training. We've fundamentally in the West separated, and again, this is going to sound a little bit like spiritual woo woo, and yes, I am religious and spiritual, but just hear me out on this. In the reality, spirituality, academics, and your physical health are all completely intertwined. They are not separate spheres of existence. They do not separately exist from one another. They all have to be taken into account together. And that's where I do respect Marx in so far as dialectical materialism goes, and where I respect Joseph Stalin where he did actually visit the Haudenosaunee Confederacy a couple of times to learn from them, and he actually did incorporate the what he calls metaphysical aspects into his basically distillation of Lenin and Marx and Engels and all these other all these other guys. He did actually incorporate those things, whereas by and large, Western academia will try to separate them. You want to learn something about theology, you go to college to learn theology, versus an everyday person already has theology. They already look at it through a lens of practical application. Whereas academics are basically just these armchair, douchebags jerking each other off over who's got the better idea. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's a real problem. And like, I used to be a philosophy major, and I think that's also why I have such a heart. Like, in so many ways, like, I'm glad because I think it's led me to making video essays and stuff. And then in other ways, I think I'm just so burnt out from the Western way of understanding philosophy. And it's so, I think that's why the Red Deal is so, so, so refreshing to me because it's so applicable. It's talking about right now. And I can hear what's going on from an indigenous perspective as opposed to some sort of like philosophical idea where it's an idea arguing with another idea that's detached. It's right here, and yeah, um, yeah. So I think we got a little bit. Not that it's wrong that we're being a bit tangential, but I do want to ask if people have anything else they want to say about the Red Deal specifically, about the conclusion, or just something in general. My favorite section of the Red Deal was the last section, "Heal Our Planet." Like, it just said some. Let me go over it really fast. It's some really, really, really cool stuff. Um, oh, clean, sustainable energy. Something that like really like blew my mind was how it talked about how like people talk about how there's like green energy, but actually like so much of that green energy is dependent on lithium batteries. And how do you get that energy? You get it by exploiting um people. You get it by exploiting like other countries and child labor. And so it's like, even though it's green, it's still not good. And just it, because it's wrapped up in capitalism. And that was like something that just like blew my mind, where I was like, yeah, like all these, we have to just I feel like this book just made it so clear like how much we have to revolutionize our thinking because capitalism is so entrenched. But that's just something that stood out to me, and I just was wondering if there's anything else anyone wants to add, especially Kemi, Yana, Silver Spook. I know Positive Synergies here. I think I said
I could
Yana.
probably add something.
Yeah, definitely. If anyone wants to add anything.
Yeah, I was just thinking, yeah, on the clean energy topic. I just learned this phrase the other day because how the U.S. banned my language, and so I'm trying to learn more Hawaiian every day. The children are still being punished this year speaking Hawaiian in public schools in the illegal occupation. Anyways, but yeah, but specifically, uh, kaikehu mai kahui nuclea. That's Hawaiian for we can achieve infinite clean energy from nuclear fusion. Um, and why am I bringing that up? One of our indigenous relative countries that is the most important country right now. It's to the west of where I am. China has achieved tritium and hydrogen artificial sun fusion for 20 plus minutes at 5 times the core temperature of the sun, and yeah, that's not a silver. There is no silver bullet, but that is achievement of an actual existing red deal. I would argue there's 1.4 billion people that have existed for thousands of years, 6 separate ethnic regions. Those languages aren't banned. I was just talking to a Uyghur actually yesterday, and they were saying it's terrible that United States illegal state of Hawaii stops you from speaking native Hawaiian language. Your children are coming home crying. They can't speak Hawaiian in their classrooms. That's really terrible. speak Kazakh, speak Mandarin, speak Uyghur. Language isn't on all our money. Sad that your country is accusing me of a forced laborer, and so that my family is losing AI programming jobs, or making neural networks to help program the tractors, or in an automated fashion, out destroying the local environment, producing mass quantities of grain, and we're also doing solar engineering, the world's largest renewable energy plants. I mean, not including the hui nuclea. Hui is a word that is a Hawaiian, Chinese, Vietnamese, and Maori word, and also Samoan, throughout the Asia Pacific, which is half of the planet, by the way. And it means coming together, working together cooperatively. It means coming together to cooperatively do the Silver Spoon Games, this business that I run with positive synergy, and also Holly and all of our comrades here. But we also work together. We house people together in a concrete way, not in a woo woo, not in an imaginary way, in a literal. This is the work we're doing. Huawei is a 98,000 person hui. It's not a hui nuclear. That's not. It's not nuclear fusion, bringing atoms together to release infinite clean energy that would potentially crush climate change if it was allowed to. If it is fully achieved in a indefinitely sustainable magnetoplasma or not micro, macro tokamak fusion cell, could actually revolutionize that in a way that it doesn't stop all the problems of the world, but none of this is a silver bullet, like I was talking about yesterday. But um, the, the 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 West is trapped not only in its dead white girls, also trapped its own imperial propaganda. It's trapped in a matrix of its own diseducation, and one of them is that the Hawaii itself is this like vacation paradise. This idyllic postcard. Escapade. It's like Disneyland, the tropics. That's false. Absolutely false. Don't come here, by the way, until Red Hill's cleaned up, because we're not gonna have any potable water for a million people this summer when the wells fully salinate with salt water or jet fuel. They just spilled jet fuel like 8-9 days ago, and so don't come here. I'm not saying you should never come, because again, I have like Uyghur friends are like, have tourism. I don't see why you don't want tourism. I'm like, well, you don't understand. The way that they do tourism here is that we have to work for $7 an hour for starvation wages, dancing fake plastic versions of our sacred dances, in these giant hotels that are also destroying our land and also are over consuming our resources. And there are 10% of our entire water supply is being used by 7 U.S. military golf courses and 40 other billionaire golf courses, including Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg's. Mark Zuckerberg just bought a reservoir. So there is a way to do this, but you have to look to those actually. And this is a point I try to bring up often. Is like, it's very difficult to do this in English because everyone is bombarded with nonsense all day long. The education of an 8-year-old in Vietnam is beyond anything achieved anywhere in the U.S., in Canada, in Europe. I include myself in that because I personally have been bombarded with nonsense. And the philosophy department is one, the English department is one, the history department, the political science department, right? It is mass disinformation to maintain a tiny minority of people's infinite profit, power, and resource and accolade accumulation. In university, it's not profit accumulation; it's like prestige, accolade, and footnote accumulation, or your personal, I don't know, self-masturbatory, ego tripping. I don't know what you get out of it, but that's why I don't participate that much in that world in the West. I'm not saying that there's nothing that you can't do that important work while working at universities, higher education, writing books. I'm just saying, like, what they're gonna privilege is not what is most important and relevant. But that's not the case. That's not the case in our other relatives countries, because they are applying using the actual knowledge. The reason why I bring up that Hawaiian sentence I just told you is because they are applying actual knowledge in a concrete, true, in an actual useful, true way, and privileging that knowledge in a country of 1.4 billion people. Um, and that can't be they will tell you this. That cannot be replicated in the United States. And as an indigenous country, like Europe, they're not people that have. It's not a place that has been genocided and displaced, and now there's another invading perpetual disinformation and mass violence based society standing on top of it. They have been there for multi thousands of years, tens of thousands of years in many cases. And I was telling Lua this yesterday, and I'll end this, but it's the difficulty is that you have 98% indigenous people in China, 96 to 99%. I don't have the exact number, but it's looking it up. It's about 96% indigenous people in Vietnam, 60% in Bolivia. Another very successful case, but not slightly less successful, I would say, of building an advanced indigenous. It's a living red deal. You must study it. I try to study it as much as I possibly can in those places. The United States is the world's largest white settler colony. It's 5 times larger than any other white country. This is why Europe is America's puppet now. NATO is a hammer to smash all of the French livelihoods and German jobs and all of the Italian fascism that's erupting is being smashed into Russia and China, which you have to acknowledge that. If you can't deal with that, there's no hope for the West, because the military-industrial complex will destroy you. It's destroying. The United States is killing its own parent to make money and power, because it is the world's largest white capitalist settler colony. It's the world's largest white country. It is 2% indigenous. That is 4% indigenous, in the sense of the people that are from there. So that's why it's an incredibly difficult problem that has to be acknowledged. I don't think it's possible in the United States. I'm not saying that you have to listen to the white people, but we have to try to meet some of them where they are, because while asking them, please, you have to listen to us. You have to please listen to us. Please listen to us. I don't know. It's such a difficult problem, but that is an elephant in the room that we do have to address. And part of the way that we address it is by trying to partner and look at and try to help. I don't exactly know how to do this, to be honest, but how to facilitate exchange. And it's like a catch-22, right? You have infinite hubris, infinite white Western centrism that needs to listen to its older. It's like a child that's needs to listen to its parents. It's the way that it's the West and the East need to listen. The West and the East, but it's also the East and all the indigenous peoples of the world, right? And again, China is just the most successful red deal, and the West needs to listen to people, but they don't want to, because they believe they have all of the answers. And if you tell them no, you don't have all the answers, sometimes they'll dig their heels in more. But anyway, I want to come back to that concept. So there is a possible way to achieve clean energy, and there's a way to achieve clean energy without there is no ecology. I don't want to say there's no zero. There is no perfect way to achieve the resources we need to stream this stream right now. Let's be real. It takes lithium, it takes electricity, it takes copper. That's got to come from somewhere. We're not going to be doing any streaming. There is a certain amount of resources that will have to come from places. There is a way to remove certain amounts of resources from the planet, from the Aina, from our non-human sentient relatives, that is balancing their needs with human needs, but we will need to do some of that, because the people of Niger are not going to live without electricity. They don't deserve to live without electricity so that France can light themselves. The planet burns. The people of Afghanistan, 2/3 of which don't have electricity, don't deserve to not have electricity. The people of Hawaii, who had electricity before the United States, its capital, don't deserve to go live in the dark. Europe can live in the dark for a little bit if they want to play military-industrial war games. their neighbors for the because they're too weak, too cowardly to face their own parent. I mean, their own grown-up giant baby child, in the United States, say no, we're not going to participate. Your ridiculous war that we can't deal with any of this stuff. We don't deal with the military-industrial complex, and so anyway, that's a lot. But I just want to kind of just like leaven that conversation with indigenous future will have artificial intelligence and artificial. It will have nuclear fusion. It will also coexist with nature as the Xinjiang Uyghur farmers who have been in that bioregion for millennia, using their local they're using their goat herding techniques in tandem with the world's largest multi-thousand square mile solar farms. Goats like eat the weeds and the grass beneath and the sassafras beneath the solar panels to keep that area clear. And there is a way to do that. There's nobody even have the beginning of that solution in the United States, but we have to learn. Anyway, I'll stop talking.
Um, I actually, a lot of what Silver Spook was just saying kind of, and they don't necessarily directly say it in the book, but uh they do kind of hint at it, and that's the idea of decolonization and land back. And obviously we'll talk for days on end about land back if I could, but I think a lot of people aren't necessarily sure about what land back means. And it means everything basically. There is no single, like, oh, this is how you define it or this is how you define it. No, it's a political, it's a social, it's a technological, it's an environmental program, it's an everything program. It like Silver Spook was talking about, the Uyghur farmers that send their goats through the solar farms to eat the grass and the sassafras and the weeds to keep the area clear so the sun can hit the solar panels. That's a technological solution based on the indigenous practices of those Uyghur farmers. Or in the case of something like uh, agriculture here in North America, there are ways of planting or ways of planting crops like the Three Sisters method, which is corn, beans, and I don't remember the other one. I think tomatoes or something like that, or potatoes. I don't remember. But corn, beans, and or I'm sorry, it was onions. You plant them within within proximity to each other, and they all live more or less symbiotically. That's an indigenous technique that was not just practiced up here in North America. It was practiced more or less all around the world, wherever they could grow crops, wherever the land allowed for it. They would use a similar Three Sisters technique. That's an indigenous solution to a settler problem or a colonialist problem. And that's kind of the heart of land back, and kind of what the book I think was trying to get at in general, with bringing up, here's this problem, this problem, this problem, here are these solutions. They were more or less presenting land back and decolonization in a way that could fully encompass all of the problems while also positioning indigenous people, and again, global indigenous people, not just Turtle Island, not just Hawaii, not just, South Asia or wherever, the global indigenous population as the people that need to be heading up these solutions. It's not saying, oh, only North American indigenous people can lead these movements. No, it's saying, indigenous African people, even displaced black people on Turtle Island. This is my own personal belief. The victims of literal kidnapping, their ancestors were kidnapped. They have just as much right to lead that movement as I do, or as Silver, or well, I wouldn't say Silver Spook, but anyone else on on the North American continent. they've just as much right to be heading up that stewardship as anyone else, as the rest of us do, because they are literal kidnapping victims. It's kind of fucked up for anyone to say, "Oh no, you don't get a say in this, even though you got brought here by force." That's a little fucked up. But I think that that's kind of the general vibe of what the book was trying to get at without directly stating it. Was, you know, indigenous people all over the world need to be heading these things up, or we're not going to get anywhere. Does that make sense?
Um, yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah, and one thing that I want to also add about like the thing that it points out about green energy is that I think it's not saying that like
Um,
because the book goes out of its
Real
way to
quick.
oh yeah.
Oh, I will be right back. My boss is just about here. She's got to drop some supplies off to me, so I'll be right back. Okay.
Okay, cool. But the book says like we're not primitivists. The future uh looks like having technology. And so like when the book talks about green energy, it's not so much saying that we won't have batteries because our society needs batteries at this point. It's more actually getting at like who's exploited in extracting the resources for the batteries, and how when people talk about green energy, there's still exploitation because of its ties to capitalism. And so what's really getting at is like we need to end capitalism so we can have green energy in a non-exploitative way. And how people kind of get tricked by the word green energy and you're like, oh, green, that's great. But they are not seeing the capitalist element of it and looking into the exploitation. We're also running a little bit over, so I want to wrap up, and then we're going to talk about what we're going to read for our next book. But before we do that, I just want to make sure: has everyone said what they've wanted to say about the Red Deal, or does anyone have anything to add?
I have something to add. Um, from when Toby was talking earlier about that book that talked about the older writers who were like, I was wrong about the economy and things like that. And to tie it into like a recommendation for a next book, I'm reading Sweetgrass, which is this book. I'm only like halfway through it, and I've been in the process of reading it for like a year and a half at this point, maybe 2 years. So would love a book club for it. But they mentioned in here about how like when indigenous people on Turtle Island and colonizers that came over were like interacting and making treaties and stuff, there was like miscommunication because the indigenous people, the colonizers, Westerners that came over, were operating on like property as like in like their idea of economy, whereas on the indigenous side they were operating on a gift economy, where the currency is reciprocity. So that's where like that term, not so great term, Indian giver comes from, because there's that expectation like I'm giving you this gift and this gift will come back for all of like tenfold for all of us so that we can all flourish together. And like if that becomes a currency, then there will always be reciprocity, and then there will always be like flourishing in that sense. Um, and then I also wanted to mention, bringing it back to the thing about words and language, the a little fun fact that I learned in Ainu language, school and prison are the same word. So that's something that is in my mind a lot. Um, and also in the book, they mentioned um, the two greatest threats faced peoples are the loss of ancestral knowledge, and those two are so deeply intertwined because the language informs like the land informs the language, and then that language holds the indigenous knowledge and like wisdom about the land. And so using if you know that language, you know how to take care of that land, or at least that's the idea of it, that I understand it. Um, and if we and as Silverspook was talking about, like Hawaiian was almost extinct, and now a lot of the Ryukyuan languages are almost extinct. And like Ryukyu is the Ryukyu Islands, which is Okinawa and Okinawa Island, and also all those surrounding islands in Okinawa Prefecture, and I think also two other islands in another prefecture. And they extend all the way from the southern tip of the main island of Japan to main island to Taiwan. So that whole string is like the Ryukyu Islands, which is modern day Okinawa, which is undergoing double colonization by both Japan and the U.S. Um, and as a result of that, as a result of um, Japanese imperialism and them trying to wipe out our culture and language are like a mass reduction in speakers over the past years, past decades. And there is like a great desire among the diaspora to like revive, start reviving and revitalizing language, or another term is normalize it, because it's unnatural for language to like disappear. It's natural for language to be passed on. So it's not like, rather than revitalization, like shifting from that angle to like normalization, because it's needs to be revitalized because it's being oppressed. Um, but yeah, so that, I think that's a very important part, is the language aspect, because for a long time, as I was learning, I guess for the past year or so, as I was learning about like even before I learned that I was indigenous, or have indigenous ancestry, I was learning about like indigenous wisdom and stuff, and I'm like, where is this indigenous wisdom that people are talking about? And it's like it's in the language, and that's how it gets passed on. And since, especially in the Ryukyus, like a lot of our older folks are survivors of the war, the Battle of Okinawa, which led to the slaughter of like a quarter to a third of the Okinawan civilian populations, not even like people that were children that were taken as like part of the troops and stuff, but just civilians. A third to a fourth to a third were like wiped out during the Battle of Okinawa, and a lot of those, and even before then, the language had been banned. So more and more people were like ashamed of speaking it, and it was seen as like a lesser than thing, as with a lot of indigenous languages. So now it's getting to the point where it's difficult to be able to talk to our elders and have that language passed on, because they carry that shame and that embarrassment, and it's like the the younger generations like trying to heal ourselves and like heal our connection in relation to our cultures and stuff. And I'm hopeful that doing that, we will also be able to help heal our ancestors and our ancestral wounds, and that hopefully our world wound, I guess.
Um, that's actually kind of an interesting topic or thing that Akemi was just saying, where they were talking about like the destruction and the banning of their language, and it's especially strange for the Cherokee Nation, where you essentially have, because of the Trail of Tears, and obviously it didn't apply just to the Cherokee, it was also the Chickasaw, Choctaw, as well as the Muskogee people. Um, but it's kind of a strange case where you have the United Kituwa bands out in the east, and that's kind of the remnants of the people that didn't move or weren't necessarily forced to move. They were given that allotted land, what was left of it, out in like the Georgia Carolinas area. And then you have obviously the Five Tribes Nation, where the Cherokee Nation is out in Oklahoma. So you have this sort of split between the Overhill dialect in the West in Oklahoma, and then the Kituwa dialect. And looking at the two nations, because of the way that colonialism affected us, you have almost these two completely different cultures kind of coming into being, because you have, obviously it's a little bit more cohesive because that's much more, they're much more familiar with that. That's the ancestral land. But then you have this sort of fusion of cultures that weren't neighbors to one another, kind of learning and mixing with each other, and sort of forming that language now. So the Overhill dialect is actually somewhat different to the original Kituwa dialect. And that, it's just kind of an interesting way of kind of crushing. It's that old divide and conquer tactic, basically. The Romans were very, very known for that divide and conquer tactic, where you weaken that population of people by separating them, or chopping that population in half and moving the other half basically halfway across the country. Putting them with people that they don't necessarily know very well, or don't necessarily share a lot of cultural or traditional links with.
Um, if if it's okay, I kind of want to go back to. Were you gonna say something, Kemi? Because I was gonna say something that might be like a little bit off topic.
I was just gonna say another fun fact that the Ryukyuan languages, the Ryukyuan language that I'm learning right now, Uchinaguchi, which is Central Southern Okinawan, has like 400 plus dialects, and that's just in half of one island.
It's a lot of dialects.
And that's just what we know of.
Um, really fast, I just wanted to say something that like went back to what you were saying, Yana, about Black people and being part of Land Back. Like, I've been thinking about this, and like, I definitely don't want to center myself like as a Black person. I don't want to center myself when it comes to Land Back, but I think when it comes to talking about colonialism and decolonization, I like something that's really frustrated me is like when everything that happened with the debate that blew up, like I was talking about what colonialism was, and I was talking about African countries because I have read some books on that. And just but the way that people were saying like that's not your place to talk about that, because people like only understood colonialism in terms of like American or Canadian indigenous people. um like I do think that like Black people, even though we're not like colonized in the sense of like this is not our land, we are constantly dealing with the white supremacist colonial structures that actually did strip Black slaves of like our languages. And um that's where AAV comes from, because you have Black people like kind of just like making a language out of that. And all these things like just so I think there's a way where it's like Black people are very invested in talking about colonialism, and at the same time, like I think with Land Back, I obviously want to give don't want to center myself. I want to, indigenous people to really be talking about that because they're talking about their land. But there's a way where, because Black people suffer under the same white supremacist colonial structure, that Black people are a lot. But it's been a different conversation, and I also think it makes sense for obviously everyone to be talking about decolonization, but especially for Black and indigenous people to be really intentionally collaborating, because it makes me kind of sad to realize, because like I'll hear how indigenous people talk about it, and I'll hear about how Black people talk about it, and it's not that there's not crossover, but I think there needs to be a lot more, given how much these issues affect both of us. So I really hope to see that happen, to see more collaboration between Black and indigenous people. And I know it's happening, but I want to see more of it. So that's kind of my thoughts
Sure.
on like Black, you know, I don't want to center myself in a way where it's like at the end of the day this is your land, and I want to be supportive in the way, whatever way I can be. Um
I
yeah.
I definitely understand what you're saying, and of course, like I'm not gonna push my particular perspective on you or any other Black person, but where I'm coming from is not only are, Black people in the United States the victims of kidnapping, it is obviously that their ancestors were literally kidnapped and then enslaved. But also there's that historic um connection between, especially, enslaved people when they were, fleeing the, or they were and just kind of moved in with an indigenous nation, in the area. There is obviously also that connection, and there are a lot of Black natives. So, and that kind of makes it difficult, especially, and I'm going to say this right now, natives, like non-black natives, were fucking racist. Like I've seen so many non-black natives be just terribly anti-black. It is easier to be a white passing native than it is to be a black native. And I will not hear anything else about that. Like that is the way that it is. You get treated like shit if you are a black native. I've seen it, and it's fucking disgusting. Like our ancestors figured this out already. What are we doing? We need to get our heads out of our asses. But the way that's why I personally say, uh it's not just up to natives in North America, especially. It's not just up to us. Like, yes, it is our land, or we are the original stewards of the land, but it gets more complicated than that, especially with the history of the way colonization brought people over and then forced that colonization on them. And then when they escaped, the plantation, or they, were freedmen, and then they just, moved into like the neighboring indigenous community, they became part of that community. They are now considered, they're considered Shawnee, or they're considered, Mohawk, or they're considered Cherokee, or they're considered, you know, Powhatan, whatever, whatever it might be. Does that kind of make sense? The way that again, I'm still coming out the back end of bronchitis, so my brain is kind of broken, but hopefully I'm making sense with everything that I've said today so far.
Yeah, like it sounds like you're saying like like it's there's a complicated layer because of slavery, and yeah, and so there's a way that that needs to be addressed as well. Um, that sounds like we were getting at.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
To that point, real quick. So I went to like a virtual conference the other day, and this was the first. So I'm sure we've all heard like land acknowledgements before, but this was the first time, and there was only one of the presenters that I'd heard a labor acknowledgement. And if I might share, I took a screenshot of it. So it's a labor acknowledgement. We recognize that the United States, as we know it, was built at the often fatal expense of forcefully enslaved Black people. We must acknowledge that much of what we know of this country today, including its culture, economic growth, and development, has been made possible by the labor of enslaved Africans and their descendants who suffered the horror of the transatlantic trafficking, chattel slavery, and later on dehumanization through segregation and Jim Crow laws. We acknowledge and remember those who did not survive the Middle Passage, those who were beaten and lynched as a result of white supremacy, and those who are still suffering while fighting for their freedom. We are indebted to their labor and their unwilling sacrifice, and we must acknowledge the tremors of that violence throughout the generations, and the resulting impact and generational trauma is still felt and witnessed today. Today, we are indebted to their labor and the labor of many Black and brown bodies that continue to work in the shadows for our collective benefit. So that was the first time I had heard one of those, and it was like very impactful for me as like a non-Black person. So I can imagine that it was impactful for like Black folks in the audience. Um, but I think that just goes to show how important it is, like for both to hear both Black and Indigenous and Black Indigenous, because there are lots voices, and bringing those forward and making space for those.
Yeah, definitely.
So I don't want to get us off topic, but if I can add something here, listening to that acknowledgement, I felt kind of pissed because of the way that it wrapped up. It was like, we acknowledge the labor that it took to get here, and I'm like, bruh, what am I supposed to do with this acknowledgement? Like, you didn't know, we didn't know. What are we? Where are we going from here? What is this, right? And what it reminds me of is that like there's a book that was really impactful for me. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. Vine Deloria Jr.'s "Custer Died for Your Sins" has this section where it's an indigenous critiquing the he saw like a bunch of mistakes that were being made at the time, and this is why I like really feel Lewis' point of Black and Indigenous people needing to collaborate more, because it's like, there was something really going there in the '60s and '70s and stuff, and it's like if we really actually like got together and discussed, okay, here's where you're going right, here's where you're going wrong, here's what my experience is with colonialism, and here's what we can do about this, then it really could have made some moves. And it's like, I don't necessarily know how y'all feel about land acknowledgements, but like hearing that labor acknowledgement, I'm like, this is a going past of each other's visions and each other's experiences and stuff. And it's a really like we need to link up sort of thing.
Yeah, like when I hear like what indigenous people go through with racism, and then I'll hear like so many similar things that I as a Black person go through, and it's like, yo, we need to be talking. I think that happens too with other just people of color in general. I know people don't like the blanket term, But I think a lot of times when we talk about racial issues, it's like, okay, like this is what Latine people have to deal with. And so like and then it's this feeling of like you're on your own. And for black people, it's like this is what these are black issues around racism. We're fighting these as black people on our own. And something that's been really amazing about, for example, something like book club and even some classes that I've taken where there's a bunch of people of color where we're just like getting together being like, yeah, this was really fucked up. And it's like, oh, you experienced that too? Because also for me as a black person, since my skin's brown, like I immediately it's so clear that I am black. Like other people of color, I know like a lot of Latina people can kind of pass as white, and so people will say racist things once they find out they're Latina. But for me, it's like I'm like, okay, like I am experiencing these things because I'm black, and there's this mentality of like, there's just something about being black that's just gonna, bring in racism. And then when I hear other people going through it, I'm like, oh my gosh, like, okay, other people are going through this. And so, yeah, I would really like to in general, create this mentality of like, we are all sick and tired of racism. Let's just be, let's take notes from each other. Let's like, like let's stand together against this. But like, especially with like indigenous people, yeah, there's just like some things that I hear about where I'm just like, oh my gosh, like I can't believe that you also have to like go through this on a regular basis and how like messed up that is. And yeah, we should collaborate.
I
I
think
just want to say something on this kind of. I want to just quickly tie like what you just said, Lua, because I totally feel that. And like labor acknowledgments of slavery and the land acknowledgments, and kind of like what I said, like you have 98% people that are not indigenous in the sense they are ancestrally from the United States, and 4% in Canada. And just as an example of how even racism itself, not to say that there are zero prejudices in as a native Hawaiian, I could speak for Hawaii. um, but when United States, before United States illegally occupied and destroyed our universal healthcare system and imprisoned our elected leaders, stole our land, et cetera, banned our language and culture. Before that, Hawaii. This is a very important point actually, because you can, that speaks to people of color, black people and indigenous people coming together, along with other non, fair skinned people or white people that are currently calling them identifying as white and identified as white in the United States. In Hawaii, the Chinese, some people will accuse them of, or Chinese, other Asians, of being settler colonizers here. Now, certainly in Okinawa, that what Japanese have done to the Uchinachu Okinawan people is definitely colonization. That is different, however, from what happened in the 1800s here. Hawaiians were losing population due to disease and other factors, but which we also limited due to using medicine and isolation and vaccines. There were no vaccine protests, by the way. There were no anti-mask. There were no anti-vax rallies because Hawaiians had 98% literacy and they were the most educated scientific people on the planet at the time. That's why we invented universal health care in 1859. Before Marx published Das Kapital 8 years before. In Hawaii, in people were needing to come partially because of colonial degradation, of the Opium Wars and the century of humiliation, the Chinese in particular. They were invited, and they came, and they were also sometimes invited in. When they arrived, they are not indigenous. The Chinese people are not indigenous, right, in that sense, to the Hawaiian land. However, when they arrived, they formed that word hui, the same word that means fusion of hydrogen atoms. It's such a beautiful concept. I just realized meeting of hydrogen atoms that can release infinite clean energy. The meeting of the Hawaiian and the Chinese people, hui, which is a word that means worker cooperative. So Hawaiians working with Chinese people to farm rice and kalo. The Chinese had their own agricultural methods, were indigenous to China. There was a migration, not a colonization, divided by the indigenous Hawaiian peoples, and they worked together to produce a lot of wealth, a lot of prosperity, and that the Chinese are actually part of the process for building what I argue is the most successful socialist country, the most successful Red Deal of the 1800 era. Again, like all the thing I've listed these all the time, so I don't want to relist them again. But again, invented submarines, universal health care, 98% literacy, 10 times more than all of Europe and the United States. World's first head of state to circumnavigate the globe, internationally recognized by Europe as more enlightened. More enlightened, that's the Europeans' word in Paris, 1869. And and that was a collaboration between two different peoples working together, not one, another, a settler colonizing, bringing, there are three things happening in the United States. You have many things happening. One of them is settler colonization, subjugating, banning the languages, like we just said, of Cherokee people, integrating their culture, subhumanizing indigenous people, wiping out indigenous people, taking another indigenous people to Africa, bringing them over as slaves. To be clear, white capitalists from Europe, in Euro-settler colonizers, brought coolies. That's the other word for forced servitude. It's not the same as slavery in the United States, but it's a similar concept. They brought white capitalist plantations such as Dole pineapple. Don't have any more of those pineapples, by the way. Dole pineapple, the sugar barons, they brought Chinese, other Asians, Filipino, to be subservient, subhumanized labor on their specific plantations in Hawaii, which is what the Hawaiians and the Chinese were fighting against, and then the United States backed the coup like they always do everywhere. But importantly, there is a way that people can move from a land that they for whatever reason they're from for thousands of years, move to a new place. They don't stop being from their land, whether that was Africa or that was China or that was Vietnam. I had a lot of Vietnamese students in the ghettos of Gali Palamba, but they don't stop. You don't stop being who your ancestors were. Alchemy is indigenous, Ryukyuan in the United States. You don't become disconnected from 7 generations or the 70 generations from your past as you move into the 7 generations into the future. But you can move, and you can move in a way that is what we call, you can hui, you move. You can be force moved, then subjugated by someone else. It's slavery, servitude, and you don't that history doesn't disappear, and you just become. But you can live, you can change the history. I believe you must acknowledge it in order to live indigenously. But as you move forward, you can live indigenously with the people that you are with. You can live as a colonizer with the people you are with. And I have Hawaiian family that work for the U.S. military. They make $300,000 a year plotting about how to shoot more missiles into Afghanistan or operating drones from Navy ships. They are living as Hawaiians, as colonizers. They are stormtroopers of the U.S. empire. And that's a very important point. That's it's a hard one to wrap heads around. I think that's it, because it does offer a path of hope for all the people of whatever color the United States, I think. And yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and one thing that I really like about the Red Deal is it talks about how this I think the Red Deal really is a path of hope for everyone. And I think sometimes when talking about racial issues and racial tensions, people be like, oh, this isn't something that includes white people. And I feel like the Red Deal does a good job of saying these are frustrations with colonialism, white supremacy, and all of us can participate in a way forward, and that is for everyone. Yeah, so I have to get going soon, and we went over quite a bit, and so I think whenever we have a closing book club for a book, they always go over time, and I just need to be realistic and be okay, book club's probably going to be an hour and a half or 2 hours. But as we're wrapping up, I want to talk about what books we're going to read next. So for anyone who's wants to leave, this might be a good time because I feel like the book club portions were closing up. But we're going to talk about what we're going to read next, talk about some ideas, and figure out when we're going to vote on that. So does that sound good with everyone? Oh, also maybe someone had something to say in response to Silver Spook. I don't want to cut anyone off. Did anyone have something they wanted to
I
add?
just want to ask a quick question. So, club is supposed to be 1 hour.
Yeah, book clubs are normally 1 hour, and
Oh, I'm sorry.
no, it's not you. It's like it's literally every time we have a book club where it's like, okay, we're going over the last chapter, it ends up being like an hour and a half or 2 hours long, and I just need to be real about that. It's every time. And so cuz people are we're talking about like our overall view of the book, and so obviously we're going to talk about a bunch of things. Um and it was a really good
Since
conversation too.
since the book club portion is coming to a close, I am gonna hop out. I actually have book club later today, which we're also
Nice.
going over the red deal in that one. It's from the server that I invited you to.
It's like instead of bar
We're
hopping,
going
it's
over
book club hopping.
book club hopping, yeah. But thank you for having me on again.
Yeah.
Obviously, if I have a copy of the next book that y'all decide to go over, I will read it in between reading Red Skin, White Masks. I am finishing up State and Revolution by Lenin, and God, he's so boring. He's so boring. Uh, but yeah, don't have to go on E. That means see you all later. Have a good day.
See ya. Thanks for coming. All right. Anyone else need to go? I know it can be awkward finding a good time to say goodbye. All right. So I'm sharing my screen.
So,
Oh wait, Jeremy, was that you?
all right, just really quick, I wanted to ask. I just noticed that Silver Spook, you and Lua had a stream. Was it like yesterday or the day before or something like that? What was that about? If you could like summarize in like a minute.
It was about this book. That's so funny because Jan is also going
Yo,
to a book club about this book, so it is the talk of the town.
This book is really
awesome.
popular.
Okay, cool.
Um, so I have a Google Docs. I put it in the voice chat text, and people can look at that there and add anything they want. So I just like talking about what each book is about a little bit, just so people have an idea, and then we'll vote in the next few days, hopefully. But also
Yeah.
Tom's gone, so I want to check in with him because I know he probably wants to talk about it. It's very late for him. He's in like a different part of the world. I forgot where he is, but
He
he's in a
didn't
place where,
post a public.
huh?
He didn't post the link publicly, so it's kind of blocked out for everyone.
Oh, I need to
He
make it
put it in the
public.
chat.
That's right. Okay, so um wait, share and then anyone with the link can edit. Okay. I don't know if it needs a new link, so I'm posting that again in the chat. So I have a few books in mind. The first is an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. I am just really just curious. I mean, not everyone in this group is in the U.S., but since I am in the U.S., I am very curious about that. It's always shocking, like learning about U.S. history from a non-white perspective. It's like always just so telling. Um, so I'm very interested in that book. Another one is New Worlds of Indigenous Resistance. It's written by Noam Chomsky, but a bunch of other, written by also a lot of Indigenous voices. And it looks like a lot of them are from the global South. And that's something that I'm really interested in because the Red Deal is great, but it talks about a lot of stuff happening in the US and Canada. I'm really curious to learn what's going on like in the rest of the world because I really don't know. And it seems like extremely important and I'm like not plugged in. And then another one that is a shorter reading is Make Rojava Green Again. And it just talks about the Rojava people. And that one seems also really interesting. I hear they're like practicing like anarcho-syndicalism or something like that, and like right now like they are practicing these things, and just seems like, I don't know, it just seems like really interesting. And it also sounds like it could be potentially uplifting, which is nice because like I don't think I could handle a very like depressing or heavy book. But then also, there's no way the indigenous people's history of the United States is going to be positive unless it's pre-colonialism. So, um, yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking of. And if anyone wanted to add something and be like, "Hey, this is why I want to nominate this book," um, we can talk about that here. So, yeah, any
So you want
thoughts?
to add it to the list, or because I wanted to recommend this one,
Yeah, go
Braiding
ahead.
Sweetgrass. Okay,
I'll put a
Or
recommendation in.
sorry, what was the name or the book called, Takemi? Oh,
Braiding Sweetgrass.
okay. And yeah, you're doing one, Corin. Do you both want to talk about a little bit about what your books are about?
So I have only gone like maybe a fifth of the way through this, but so far, or the this is Braiding Sweetgrass: Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And I believe, I don't remember what tribe specifically she's from, but I know the language is Potawatomi. Um, and she grew up like being told like, oh, you can't be a scientist, you're native, and like native kids don't do that type of thing. And so like went on to be like, yes, I can do that. And grew up, from what I understand, like kind of focusing more on Western science and seeing that as more legitimate, and then later on realizing like, oh, indigenous knowledge is like the way. There was one part where she described it as like when she's been doing science for too long, when she closes her eyes, it's like an after image of like indigenousness that she feels she's missing. So it's kind of like different chapters go over different things. One of the chapters called "The Gift of Strawberries" talks about like that gift economy idea that I mentioned, and there's also the opening is called "Sky Woman Falling," which is about like the tale of Sky Woman, which is like, I believe, the um, creation story of Turtle Island. Um, and then one of my favorite chapters that I've read so far is called "Learning the Grammar of Animacy," and it talks about like her starting to learn her indigenous ancestral language, and like feeling so frustrated because a lot of the time in indigenous languages, words will sound very different words will sound very similar, or like the same word can mean different things in different contexts. For example, the word for mushroom that she learned was like, I think the scientific name for it was actually like the Potawatomi name for it, and that Potawatomi term also means something like things rising mysteriously in the dark, which can mean like mushrooms, but can also mean like more not safe for work stuff. And depending on the context, it can mean like either or. And they say how like our ancestors wanted us to laugh, and that's why they made the language like this. But it can be difficult, and that's as far as I've gone through it so far. But I would really like to dig more into and like talk to other people about it as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds great. Corin, do you want to talk about the book that you added?
Obviously, I haven't read it because it's difficult for me to read books, but it's called Care Work Dreaming Disability Justice. So I believe that it is about care work and disability justice and viewing it through obviously a lens of disability justice. From what I could read on the book, it also focuses on disabled people of color and disabled queer people and how it relates to them too. Again, I haven't read it, so I don't know everything that's in it, but it sounded very interesting, and I often see it recommended next to Disability Visibility by Alex Wong, which I haven't read, but I've read some of the stuff in it, and I know that one's pretty good. So,
Yeah, that sounds really fascinating. And that could also be a really good one to read because I don't think we've read anything on disabilities yet in book club. So that could be a really good one to do. Um, does anyone have anything else they want to add to the list? Okay. okay. If anyone does think of something, just jot it down and leave a message. And um, yeah. And then I'm gonna let Tom know too, because I'm sure he's going to want to say something, but I'm sure he had to go to bed. And then we'll figure out like when to vote. And yeah. And also, I was thinking maybe, okay, since we meet every couple weeks, because I know I kind of get burnt out if we meet every week. I was wondering if could meet still meet every couple weeks, but then have book club be like an hour and a half or something, just so we can read more, because it just takes so long to get through books. But I just don't want to burn myself out either, because just with like taking notes and stuff, I think if I was just reading, it'd be one thing, but since I take notes, I just get a little bit burnt out. But maybe that's one way to like have more of a balance, is have it be an hour and a half and then just read more also. But I don't know if people have that time either, because I know sometimes we go over, but we don't do it every week, so I don't know if people can do that every week. But yeah, just something to keep in mind. But yeah, that seems like a good stopping point, and we'll probably call it good there for today. Thanks everyone so much for coming. It was a really great conversation, and like I'm really happy that you all came, because it was really great hearing everyone's thoughts. And yeah, I'll see you probably in a couple-ish weeks. Bye, everyone.
Bye, y'all.